small brass key turned in an iron lock. The lid of an old box lifted on stiff hinges. A frail woman in a faded blue cardigan sat alone at her kitchen table with the lockbox open in front of her. Her hands trembled. Her name was Edith Marsh. She was 71 years old. Her older brother Wallace had died 3 weeks ago at the age of 75 in the small frame house next door. He had been a quiet bachelor mechanic who had run a one-bay garage out of his own workshop for 40 years. He had never married. He had no children. He had left Edith his savings, his house, his tools, and a single iron lockbox he had kept under his workbench since the spring of 1953. The notary at the lawyer's office that morning had handed Edith the small brass key in a paper envelope. She had carried the envelope home in her purse. She had brewed herself a cup of weak black tea. She had set the lockbox on the kitchen table. She had waited 2 whole days before she had turned the key. She did not yet know that the box contained her own baptismal record, a marriage certificate dated 1953 that she had never seen, and a photograph of a young woman holding a baby in front of a hospital her brother had told her she had never been inside. Why had her brother kept the box locked for 71 years? Stay with me on this one. Edith had grown up in a small Ohio town outside of Akron. Her parents had been a kind, quiet couple named Walter and Helen Marsh. Walter had been a foreman at a rubber factory. Helen had been a Sunday school teacher and a careful gardener. They had raised Edith and her older brother Wallace in a 2-bedroom frame house with a vegetable patch in the backyard and a maple tree in the front. Edith had been told all her life that her natural mother had been a young woman named Joan Marsh, Walter's younger sister. Joan had married a man named Robert Holt in 1952. Joan had died of complications of childbirth in the spring of 1953 in a small county hospital. Robert Holt had been killed in a car accident on the highway 6 months later. Walter and Helen had taken the baby Edith in because there had been no one else, and they had raised her as their own. That had been the story. Edith had grown up believing it. Her brother Wallace, who had been 4 years old when she had come into the household, had always called her sister and had always treated her as sister, and had never once in 71 years given her any reason to think she was not. She had never married. She had had a quiet life as a librarian at the public library in town. She had retired at 65. She had taken care of Walter and Helen in their last years. Walter had died at 86 in 1998. Helen had died at 84 in 2002. Wallace had stayed in the family house all his life. Edith had moved into a small frame house next door to him in 2004. For 22 years, they had been neighbors as well as siblings. They had shared Sunday dinner every week. They had watched television together on Wednesday evenings. He had fixed her car. She had cooked him soup when he had the flu. He had died in his sleep 3 weeks ago. She had found him in the morning when she had come over with a thermos of coffee. The doctor had said the heart had simply stopped. There had been no pain. There had been no warning. The lawyer had read the will at her kitchen table the day after the funeral. The will had been simple. Wallace had left everything to Edith. The lawyer had explained that the iron lockbox under the workbench had been in the will as a separate paragraph. Wallace had written, "The lockbox is for Edith. The key is in the safe deposit box at the bank. Edith is to take her time before opening it. There is no hurry. The contents have waited 71 years." She had retrieved the key from the bank the next morning. She had carried the box home. Now she lifted the lid. The first paper at the top of the box was a baptismal record from St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Akron, dated April 14, 1953. The record certified the baptism of a baby girl named Mary Edith Holt. Father Robert James Holt. Mother Joan Marie Marsh Holt. Date of birth March 30, 1953. That was Edith's birthday. That was her name on the baptismal record. Mary Edith Holt. She had been told all her life that her name had been Edith Marsh from birth, that Joan had given her Walter's last name on the birth certificate at the hospital because Robert Holt had wanted nothing to do with the baby. Edith had been told that Robert Holt had abandoned Joan 2 months before Edith was born. The baptismal record showed Robert Holt as the father at the baptism, 2 weeks after Edith's birth. She set the baptismal record aside. The second paper in the box was a marriage certificate dated June 10, 1953. The marriage certificate was for Walter James Marsh and Helen Margaret Holt. Edith stared. Helen had been a Bristow, not a Holt. Helen's maiden name had been Helen Bristow. Walter and Helen had been married in 1947, before Wallace was born. Walter and Helen had told Edith their wedding story every June 10 of her childhood. The wedding had been at a Methodist church in Akron in 1947, not 1953. This marriage certificate showed Walter marrying a different Helen in 1953, 3 months after Edith's birth. Helen Margaret Holt. Edith looked at the date again. June 10, 1953. She set the marriage certificate aside. The third paper in the box was a black and white photograph. The photograph showed a young woman, perhaps 28, standing on the front steps of a brick building. She held a small bundled baby in her arms. The baby was wrapped in a knitted shawl with a pattern of small flowers. The young woman in the photograph had Edith's nose, Edith's mouth, Edith's gray eyes. The brick building behind her had a sign on the wall to the left of the front door. The sign was small in the photograph, but Edith squinted and she could read it. The sign said, Mercy Hospital, Toledo, Ohio. Edith had been told all her life that she had been born at the small county hospital in Akron. She had been told her mother had died there. She had never in 71 years been to Toledo. On the back of the photograph in her brother's hand was written, My mother Helen with my sister Edith, 3 days old, Mercy Hospital, Toledo, April 2, 1953. Edith set the photograph down. She put her hands flat on the kitchen table. The kitchen was very quiet. She did not understand what she was looking at. She breathed slowly. She picked up the photograph again. She looked at the young woman's face. The young woman in the photograph was not the Helen who had raised Edith. The Helen who had raised Edith had been a thin, kind woman with brown hair and brown eyes, and a small mole at the corner of her mouth. The young woman in the photograph had gray eyes, and Edith's own face, and a pearl button on the collar of her dress. The handwriting on the back of the photograph said, My mother Helen. Edith had to read the inscription 3 times before she understood. Her brother Wallace had written, My mother Helen. Wallace had a different mother. Wallace had been 4 years old when Edith had come into the house. Edith had always assumed that Walter and Helen Bristow Helen, the Helen of her childhood, were Wallace's parents as well as Edith's foster parents. Wallace had said so. Walter and Helen had said so. Apparently it was not so. The young woman in the photograph, Wallace's biological mother, was named Helen. Helen Margaret Holt, the marriage certificate said. Edith's biological mother, according to the baptismal record, was Joan Marie Marsh Holt. And the baptismal record showed Robert James Holt as Edith's biological father. She set the photograph down. She stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at her brother's house next door. She did not cry. She walked back to the table. She lifted the rest of the contents out of the lockbox. There was a small leather diary at the bottom. There was a pearl-buttoned woman's dress collar, yellowed with age, folded around a small lock of dark brown hair. There was a long letter in her brother Wallace's hand, sealed in an envelope. There was a brown manila envelope, tied with thin string, that she did not yet open. There was a single faded postcard with a picture of a riverside park. She broke the seal on the letter first. The letter was 8 pages. She read it slowly. The letter began, Edith, my sister. If you are reading this, I am gone, and you have taken your time to open the box, and you are sitting at your kitchen table with the baptismal record and the marriage certificate and the photograph in front of you. I am sorry to tell you the rest of the story this way. There was no good way. Mother and father asked me to keep the box closed until they had both passed. I kept my word. After they passed, I should have told you. I could not bring myself to. I am sorry. Please read all of this letter before you make any decisions. The story, according to Wallace, was the following. In 1949, a young woman named Helen Holt had moved to Toledo from a small town in Indiana. She had been 21. She had taken a job as a secretary at a steel company. She had met a young rubber factory foreman from Akron named Walter Marsh on a Saturday at a public skating rink. They had begun to date. They had married in February of 1950 at a small Methodist church in Toledo. They had moved into a one-bedroom apartment. Wallace had been born in January of 1951. In the autumn of 1951, when Wallace was 9 months old, Walter Marsh had been informed by a friend of his sister Joan's in Akron that Joan had been pregnant for 8 months and had nowhere to go. Joan had been 23. She had been working as a waitress in a small diner in Akron. She had become pregnant by a married man named Robert Holt, who was a long-distance truck driver who came through Akron on a route. He had told her he would leave his wife. He had not. When Joan had told him she was pregnant, he had stopped coming through Akron. Joan had hidden the pregnancy from her family. By the time Walter found out, Joan was 8 months along and had been turned out of her boarding house. She had been sleeping in the back room of the diner. Walter had driven to Akron the same weekend. He had brought Joan home to the apartment in Toledo. Joan had given birth to a baby girl in late March of 1952. The baby had been small but healthy. Joan had named her Mary Edith. Joan had died of a postpartum hemorrhage at Mercy Hospital in Toledo on April 6, 1952. Edith had been 10 days old. Walter and Helen had been 28 and 24 years old, with a 1-year-old son in a one-bedroom apartment and a 10-day-old infant niece on their hands, and no living parents on either side to help them. They had made a decision. They had moved back to Akron that summer. They had told the neighbors in Akron that they had a 4-month-old daughter named Edith. They had said nothing about Joan. They had told a small lie about Edith having been a friend's daughter who had been left to them. They had not told anyone in Akron the truth. Helen Holt had raised Edith as her own for 15 months. In the summer of 1953, Helen Holt had been killed in a car accident on the highway outside Toledo. She had been driving up to visit her own mother in Indiana. Wallace and Edith had been with Walter in Akron. The accident had been the only one on the highway that summer. Helen had died at the scene. Walter Marsh had been 28 years old, a widower with a 2.5-year-old son and a 15-month-old niece-daughter, and a small house in Akron, and a job at the rubber factory, and no one in the world. He had married Helen Bristow, a kind, quiet Methodist Sunday school teacher who had been a neighbor for 2 months, in June of 1953. The marriage certificate in the lockbox. Helen Bristow had raised Wallace and Edith from that day forward as her own children. She had loved them both. She had treated them both as her own. She had never told them about Helen Holt, or about Joan Marsh, or about Mercy Hospital in Toledo. She had said only, to Edith, that her natural mother had been a young woman who had died at the small Akron hospital. She had given Edith the simplest version of the truth, with the names rearranged, to spare Edith the complications. Walter had agreed. They had agreed for one reason. They had agreed because in 1953, the legitimacy of a child born out of wedlock could close the doors of every school, every job, every marriage. They had agreed because Joan Marsh had asked them, before she died, to raise the baby as their own and never tell her she was illegitimate. They had agreed because they had loved Joan, and because they had loved Helen Holt, and because they had wanted Edith to have a clean life. They had given Edith a clean life. They had given her the name of a married father, Robert Holt, who had never been her father. They had given her a Methodist mother in place of a Catholic mother. They had given her an Akron birthplace in place of a Toledo birthplace. They had given her a clean line, even though it had been a small lie. Wallace had known the truth from the age of 8, when he had asked his stepmother why the baby photograph of his sister on the parlor mantel had been taken in front of a brick building with a sign that said Mercy Hospital, Toledo. His stepmother had sat him down at the kitchen table and told him everything. He had been instructed to never tell Edith. He had agreed. He had kept his word for 63 years. The lockbox in the workshop had held the original baptismal record, the original marriage certificate, the photograph, his biological mother's pearl-buttoned dress collar, a lock of his biological mother's hair, and a letter that he, Wallace, had begun writing in 1990 and revised many times. He had also kept a small leather diary in the box. The diary was his biological mother, Helen Holt's. It had been recovered from the wreck of her car in 1953 by an Indiana state trooper. The trooper had mailed it to Walter Marsh the following spring. Walter had given it to Wallace on Wallace's 13th birthday. The diary had 2 paragraphs about Edith. The first paragraph, dated May 12, 1952, said, "Walter brought home Joan and the baby girl yesterday. Joan is so tired. The baby is so small. I do not know how we will fit. I will love her. That is all I know." The second paragraph, dated August 30, 1952, said, "Joan has been gone for 4 months. The baby calls me Mama. Walter and I have agreed she should never be told. She will have a brother and a mother and a father and a clean life. I have promised Joan in my heart that we will raise her well." Edith set the diary down on the kitchen table. She did not cry. She had not cried for a long time about anything. She rose from the kitchen table. She walked to the back door. She opened it. She stood on the small concrete porch and looked at the small backyard her brother had mowed for her every summer for 22 years. A robin landed on the fence. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Stay with me. She walked back into the kitchen. She read the rest of her brother's letter. The last paragraph said, "I want you to know one more thing. Robert Holt is alive. He is 96 years old. He lives in a nursing home in Cleveland. He has not asked about you. I have not contacted him. I know about him because in 1985, a Cleveland police detective came to my workshop with a missing persons report. Robert Holt had been arrested in 1959 for embezzlement. He had served 4 years. After that, he had drifted. In 1985, he had been picked up in Cleveland after a domestic dispute. The detective had been doing a routine search of old paternity records and had found Edith's name on the baptismal record at St. Catherine's in Akron. The detective had wanted to know if Edith wanted to be put in touch. I told the detective no. I told him that you were a 32-year-old librarian who had been raised by good people, and that your good people were still alive in 1985, and that Robert Holt had given up his right to know you the night he stopped coming through Akron. The detective agreed. He did not pursue. If you wish to contact Robert Holt now, you may. He is at the Lakeshore Care Home in Cleveland. He has dementia. He may not know you. He may not remember Joan. He may not remember anything. I do not advise the visit. I will not stop you. If you wish to contact the family of Helen Holt, my biological mother, you may. Her younger sister Beatrice is still alive in Indiana. She is 93. She knows about you. She has known about you for 70 years. She has sent me a Christmas card every December of my adult life. The Christmas cards are in the top drawer of my workshop desk. There are 48 of them. They are addressed to Wallace and Edith, every one of them. I love you, my sister. I am sorry I never said it aloud. I am sorry I never told you about Beatrice. She would like to hear from you. She has been waiting. Your brother, Wallace. Edith folded the 8 pages of the letter. She set them on the table beside the photograph. She did not put them back in the box yet. She picked up the pearl-buttoned collar. The fabric was the soft yellow of old paper. She lifted the small lock of dark brown hair from the fold. It was tied with a thin blue ribbon. The ribbon had not faded. The hair was the same color as her own hair had been at 30. She held the lock of hair for a long time. She set it back inside the collar. She picked up the brown manila envelope she had not yet opened. The string was tied in a careful double knot. Wallace had tied that knot. She knew his knots. He had tied her shoes the same way until she was 4. Inside the envelope were 3 folded sheets of cream paper, a small black and white photograph of 2 young women in 1948, and a yellowed newspaper clipping. The clipping was from the Toledo Blade. The date was July 19, 1953. The headline read, "Indiana woman killed in single-car accident on Route 24." The article was 4 short paragraphs. The article gave the name of the deceased: Helen Margaret Marsh of Akron, formerly Helen Holt of Greencastle, Indiana, age 25. She left behind a husband, Walter Marsh, and a son, Wallace, age 2. No mention of a daughter. There had been no daughter in any official record, because Edith had not yet been entered on any paper anywhere as Walter and Helen's child. The photograph showed 2 young women in flowered cotton dresses, arms linked, standing in front of a church. The taller of the 2 had Edith's face. The shorter of the 2 looked very much like the taller. The back of the photograph said in pencil, "Helen and Beatrice, Greencastle, summer 1948." The 3 sheets of cream paper were a letter to Edith, written in a careful, slow hand. The letter began, "My dear niece, I have not written to you directly in my life. Your brother asked me not to. I have kept his word as he kept his promise. He has written me twice a year for 60 years. The letter was 3 pages. Beatrice wrote that she had been Helen Holt's only sister. She had been 19 years old when Helen had moved to Toledo. She had been 23 years old when Helen had died. She had married a farmer in Greencastle in 1955. She had raised 4 children. She had lost her husband to a stroke in 1989. She had never moved. She lived in the same house on the same lane she had lived in since 1956. She wrote that Wallace had visited her once in 1973 when he had been 22. He had driven to Indiana on his own, without telling his parents, and had stayed for 1 weekend. He had told her that he could not bring Edith. He had told her that Edith did not know. He had told her that she might never know. He had asked Beatrice to keep the door open in case the day came. Beatrice had told him the door would always be open. She wrote that she had 4 grown children. She had 11 grandchildren. She had 3 great-grandchildren. They all knew about Edith. They had been told the story when each of them had turned 16. They had grown up knowing they had a cousin in Akron, Ohio, who did not yet know she was their cousin. She wrote that she was not asking Edith for anything. She was only saying that the door was open, that it had been open since 1953, and that nothing about that would change. She wrote that she had loved her sister. She had loved her sister very much. The letter ended, "I do not know if you will ever read this. Wallace told me he would put it in the box. I trust him. He was a kind boy and a kind man. He loved you. He talked about you for the whole weekend in 1973. He talked about you almost the whole letter in every letter he wrote me. He was your brother. He never wavered. Yours in hope, Beatrice Holt." Edith folded the 3 pages. She set them on top of Wallace's letter. She placed her hand flat on top of both. She closed her eyes. She breathed for a long time. She opened her eyes. She did not call Robert Holt. She walked next door to Wallace's house. She had a spare key. She let herself in. The workshop smelled of motor oil and pine. She walked to the desk in the back corner. She opened the top drawer of the desk. The 48 Christmas cards were in a manila envelope at the back of the drawer. She brought the envelope back to her own kitchen. She laid the cards out across the table in a long row, oldest to newest, the way her mother had taught her to sort photographs. The earliest card was from 1977. The card was a faded image of a country church under a thin layer of snow. The note inside was 4 sentences. The handwriting was firm and young. The note said, "Wallace and Edith, I hope you're both well. I have been thinking of you since the leaves changed. My mother passed last month. She asked after Edith near the end. Love, Aunt B. Wallace had been 26 years old in 1977. Edith had been 25. Beatrice's mother had been Edith's grandmother. The cards went year by year. The handwriting grew slower. The drawings on the fronts changed. There was a wren year. There was a chickadee year. There was a year with a sketch of a child's snow boot. There was a year with no drawing at all, only a pressed cornflower taped to the cream paper. The most recent card was dated December 22, 2025. It was a simple cream-colored card with a small pencil sketch of a wren on the front. The wren was sitting on a snow-dusted holly branch. The card was addressed to Wallace and Edith. The note inside was 3 sentences. The handwriting was old, careful, slow. Beatrice Holt, age 93. The note said, I have thought of both of you every Christmas of my life. My address has not changed since 1956. The door is always open. Love, Aunt B. Edith picked up the kitchen phone. She looked up the area code for Indiana. She dialed the number Beatrice had written under her name on the card. A soft, slow voice answered after 4 rings. This is Edith Marsh, Edith said quietly. I am Wallace's sister. Wallace died 3 weeks ago. I just opened the box. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Beatrice said, very gently, I have been waiting 71 years for that call, dear. Are you all right? Edith found, for the first time in many years, that she had tears on her face. I do not know, she said. I think I will be. Take your time, Beatrice said. I will be here. I am not going anywhere. They talked. Beatrice asked about Wallace's last weeks. Edith told her about the Sunday dinners, about the thermos of coffee, about the way she had found him. Beatrice listened. When Edith finished, Beatrice said, he was a good man. Your mother would have been proud of him. Your mother would be proud of you. Edith did not know what to say. She said, I would like to come. Beatrice said, come whenever you can, dear. There is a room at the end of the upstairs hall. It has a quilt my mother made in 1942. It is yours. Edith made an appointment to drive to Indiana on the following Saturday. Beatrice's daughter, Edith's first cousin, would drive over to pick Edith up at the train station. The conversation lasted 19 minutes. When Edith hung up the phone, she stood in the kitchen for a long time. She rested both hands on the back of a chair. She looked at the cards spread across the table. She looked at the photograph of the young woman in the pearl-buttoned collar. She had a first cousin who had been a Sunday school teacher for 40 years. She had a great niece who was a librarian at the public library in Bloomington. She had a great nephew who had been deployed to Afghanistan twice. She had an aunt who had sent her a Christmas card every year of her life. She had not known any of them for 71 years. She gathered the cards carefully. She put them back in the manila envelope. She tied the string in a knot her brother would have tied. She set the envelope on the table beside the lockbox. She picked up the diary one more time. She read Helen Holt's 2 paragraphs about her again. She turned to the front of the diary. The first page was inscribed in the same young handwriting. The inscription said, This book is the property of Helen Margaret Holt, Toledo, Ohio. Begun the day after my wedding, February 11, 1950. Edith turned the page. The diary had 84 entries. Edith read every entry that mentioned Joan. She read every entry that mentioned the baby. She read every entry that mentioned Walter. She read until the light in the kitchen turned yellow and then orange. She read until she could no longer see the letters. She turned on the lamp over the table. She finished the diary. The last entry, dated June 30, 1953, was 3 lines. The handwriting was steadier than the early entries. The handwriting said, driving up to see Mama tomorrow. Walter is keeping the babies. I will be back Sunday. I love this family more than I have words for. She had not come back Sunday. Edith closed the diary. She placed it in the lockbox. She placed the pearl-buttoned collar with its small lock of hair in the lockbox. She placed the baptismal record, the marriage certificate, the photograph, the newspaper clipping, the 2 letters, and the manila envelope of Christmas cards beside the lockbox, not inside it. She would keep those out. She lowered the lid of the lockbox. She turned the small brass key. She put the key in her cardigan pocket. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She walked outside. She sat down on the porch step of her small frame house. The robin on the fence looked at her and flew away. She did not cry. She did not laugh. She breathed. The afternoon was warm. The dogwood at the side of the house was about to bloom. She thought about the train ticket she would buy in the morning. She thought about the quilt on the bed at the end of the upstairs hall. She thought about the maple in the Indiana front yard. She thought about her brother, 4 years old, standing in a Toledo doorway with a baby sister in his small arms. She thought about her mother, 25 years old, writing in a leather diary, promising a dead friend that the baby would be raised well. It was enough. It was enough for the second day of opening the box. It was enough.